Last week, we talked about the sacraments that God gives us to let us know that we are loved and forgiven. We talked about baptism, and we talked about the Lord's Supper. And today, I want to dig in a little bit more to the Lord's Supper. You know, last week, we talked about how communion and the Lord's Supper brings forgiveness. That Jesus' real body and real blood is truly present with the real bread and the real wine. And that brings real forgiveness. And we talked about how because it brings real forgiveness and Jesus' body and blood is truly present, we need to take that reverently. We need to spend time in confession, preparing our hearts to receive not just bread and wine, but also Jesus' real presence. But you know, forgiveness is not the only benefit that communion has. Another thing about communion, and you might even hear the word in the word communion, but it brings about unity. That's why we call it communion. There is a union in it. You know, when we take communion, we are taking the Lord's Supper, the same Lord's Supper that people all around the world, other churches are taking that same Lord's Supper. And when we take the Lord's Supper, we're not just taking it with churches around the world at this time, but we're taking it with churches at all different times. The same Lord's Supper that was instituted by Jesus and in 33 or something AD is the same Lord's Supper that we take now. And this communion, well, it unifies us with that church. So it's the same Lord's Supper that John and Peter and James and Thaddeus took, and we celebrate that on Maundy, Thursday. But it is also the same supper that churches in the Middle Ages took. It's the same supper that my grandfather, that I never got to meet, he took it too. And so in some way, we are all connected. We're all one. And you know, as we have walked through times of COVID and separation and disunity, there is a message that God is giving us in communion. It's one of unity. It's one of bringing back together. It's one of saying, you know, you may feel isolated. You may feel alone. But I'm bringing you together, not just with the people that you know inside the church, but with the whole church, the Big C church, the church that expands past space and time. But you know, there's something even more to this meal. It's a meal of history. You know, back in the day, when the Israelites left Egypt, God gave them this meal of Passover to remember the mighty works that God has done. And it was that same Passover that Jesus was celebrating when he instituted the Lord's Supper. Now, there are so many different things to know about the Passover, and we're going to spend some time going through that in Maundy, Thursday services. But one thing to remember about this is that Passover is a time to remember the mighty works of God. And when we take communion, we have an opportunity to remember the mighty works of God. The mighty works that he did in the past of raising the dead and healing the sick. But also we have the ability to remember the mighty works of God that he has done in our past. So maybe a question for you today is, what is a mighty work that God has done in your past? Spend some time talking with your small group or with your parents about that question.